Hi, good morning. We were getting this thing set up. Here we go. So we are going to do one more book. We're going to do a small focus for the Great Conversation. Talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin a little bit today, and this will probably be one of the last books we talk about this year. And then we'll do one more final conversation about the Great Book Conversation. Um, so, Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm guessing you have heard of it. Um, If not, you should hear about it. So it's a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it was published in 1852. Um, it was a very, very important story. It was a major anti-slavery story. So it was writing about the horrors of slavery and how terrible it is. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was what we call an abolitionist. Abolitionist is someone who tried to end slavery in the United States, to abolish, get it, abolish, abolitionist. Um, she wrote this story 9 years before the American Civil War began. And so this story definitely had a major, major impact on the broader culture as we kind of got to this point of war in history. In fact, it's rumored, and they don't know if it's true or not, but it was rumored that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, "So this is the little lady who started this great war," meaning that because of her book, the American Civil War began. That's how divisive and important and powerful her book was. So that's something we should pay attention to. This book had a massive and profound effect on culture of its day and still remains an important work of literature today. We'll talk about it a little bit today, but one of the interesting things is that the phrase Uncle Tom has radically changed today in a way that I'm not okay with, which is sad. But anyway, as you can see here on the slide, this is a statue of Abraham Lincoln meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe. Kind of a mouthful for her name. So, anyway, um, so Uncle Tom's Cabin was the second best-selling book of the 19th century. It was second only to the Bible, which was number one. So it tells you how significant this book was. 3 years after it was published, it was called the most popular novel of our day. And as I said, unfortunately, the phrase Uncle Tom has come to mean something really negative in our culture, and often the way it's applied, and we'll talk about it more at the end, but that one person will call another black man an Uncle Tom as an insult. And generally speaking, usually what it means is that you, black men, are giving into white authorities and white power in your life, where you could stand up for your own black power situation. Instead, you're just giving in to what the white man says. So you're an Uncle Tom, which I think is horrible and unfair. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, as I said. So, all right, so the characters, the major characters. Uncle Tom, he was a dutiful slave. He was a devout Christian, and his Christian faith is important throughout the text. Arthur Shelby is Tom's original owner. And what kind of kicks off the plot here is that he sells Tom to pay off a debt. The Shelbys had talked about never selling their slaves, and yet they got in a bad financial situation, and so they had to sell a couple slaves, and so Arthur sells Tom. Eliza Harris is the other slave that is sold. Mr. Shelby is going to sell her as well to pay his debts. The problem is Eliza has a son. Anyway, we'll go over the plot more in a little bit, but Eliza is also one of the slaves. Okay, a couple other major characters. Augustine St. Clair. He is someone who buys Tom, and St. Clair and Tom definitely kind of form a bond and a unique relationship. And he plans to free Tom. Unfortunately, St. Clair is killed before he can free Tom. And lastly, we have Ava St. Clair, which is Augustine's daughter. And she is described as this angelic beauty, this perfect child who sees no difference between blacks and whites. She treats the slaves with love and dignity. And of course, she also dies. There are more characters in the story, and I will be talking about some of them as we go through the plot here. But those are kind of the big important ones. So anyway, here's the plot. Having run up large debts, a Kentucky farmer named Arthur Shelby faces the prospect of losing everything he owns. Though he and his wife, Emily, have a kind-hearted and affectionate relationship with their slaves, Shelby decides to raise money by selling two of his slaves to Mr. Haley, who is a slave trader. The slaves in question are Uncle Tom, who has a wife and children on the farm. This will separate him from his wife and children. Um, uh, and Harry, the young son of Mrs. Shelby's maid Eliza. When Shelby tells his wife about his agreement with Haley, she is appalled because she had promised Eliza that Shelby would not sell her son. I'm sorry, I made a slight mistake here. I said that Eliza was getting sold, but it was Eliza's son, Harry, that was getting sold. So that was a small mistake. I apologize for that. But Eliza overhears this conversation. Okay, and so she tells Tom, and she tells Tom's wife, and she takes her son Harry, and she runs away to the north, hoping to find freedom, and also hoping to find her husband George, who has gone to Canada. The slave trader Haley pursues her, but two other Shelby slaves alert Eliza to the danger, and she is able to evade capture by crossing the half-frozen Ohio River. This is one of the most famous scenes in the book of this mother carrying her baby with slave traders at her back as she is crossing this semi-frozen river. All right. Haley, the slave trader, hires a man named Loker and his gang to bring Eliza and Harry back. Eliza and Harry make their way to a Quaker settlement, and Quakers are a form of Christians. Okay. The Quakers agree to help Eliza and Harry, and then they are joined by Eliza's husband, George, and the family reunites and they head towards Canada. Meanwhile, Uncle Tom sadly leaves his family and Master George, Shelby's young son and Tom's friend, as Haley takes him to a boat on the Mississippi to be transported to a slave market. On the boat, Tom meets the angelic little white girl named Ava, who quickly befriends him. When Ava falls into the river, oh no, off the riverboat, Tom dives in and saves her. Augustine St. Clair gratefully agrees to buy Tom from Haley. Tom travels with St. Clair to the home in New Orleans, where he grows increasingly invaluable to the St. Clair household and increasingly close to Ava, with whom he shares a devout Christianity. Up north, George and Eliza remain in flight from Loker and his men. When Loker attempts to capture them, George shoots him in the side, and the other slave hunters run away. Eliza convinces George, her husband, and the Quakers, this Christian group, to bring Loker to the next settlement where he can be healed. Meanwhile, New Orleans, St. Clair discusses slavery with his cousin Ophelia, who opposes slavery as an institution, but harbors deep prejudices against the blacks. St. Clair, by contrast, feels no hostility against blacks, but tolerates slavery because he feels powerless to change it. And so what you see here is this very interesting contradiction. She doesn't like black people, but she thinks slavery is wrong. He likes the black people, but he's also okay with slavery. Anyway, to help his his cousin, overcome her bigotry, he buys Topsy, a little black girl, and arranges for Ophelia to begin educating her. All right. After Tom has lived with St. Clair for 2 years, Ava grows very ill. She weakens and dies, but she has a vision of heaven before she passes. Her death has a profound effect on everyone who knew her. Ophelia resolves to love the slaves. Topsy learns to trust and feel attached to others, and St. Clair decides to set Tom free. However, As I said, before he can act on his decision, St. Clair is stabbed to death while trying to settle a fight in a tavern. St. Clair does find God in his last moments, and he goes to be reunited with his mother and daughter in heaven. Um, anyway, St. Clair's cruel wife, Marie, sells Tom to a vicious plantation owner named Simon Legree. Tom is taken to rural Louisiana with a group of new slaves, including Emmeline, whom the demonic Legree has purchased to use as a sex slave, replacing his previous sex slave, Cassie. Legree takes a strong dislike to Tom when Tom refuses to whip a fellow slave as ordered. Tom receives a severe beating, and Legree resolves to crush his faith in God. Tom meets Cassie and hears her story. Separated from her daughter by slavery, she became pregnant again, but killed the child because she could not stand to have another child taken from her. Around this time, with the help of Tom Loker, now a changed man after being healed by the Quakers. Remember, he's the one that was shot in the side by Eliza and her husband George when he tried to capture them. So he's a changed man. And so Tom Loker now helps Georgia, Eliza, and Harry cross into Canada and obtain their freedom. Truly a changed man. Let's see here. Where was I? So, Tom's faith is sorely tested by his hardships, and he nearly gives up his faith. But he has two visions, one of Christ and one of Ava, which renews his spiritual strength and gives him the courage to withstand Legree's torments. He encourages Casey to escape. She does so, taking Emmeline with her, after she devises a trick in which she and Emmeline pretend to be ghosts. When Tom refuses to tell Legree where Casey and Emmeline have gone, Legree orders his overseers to beat him. When Tom is near death, he forgives Legree and the overseers. George Shelby, the son of his very first owner, George Shelby arrives with money in hand to buy Tom's freedom, but he's too late. He can only watch as Tom dies a martyr's death. Taking a boat toward freedom, Cassie and Emmeline meet George Harris's sister and travel with her to Canada, where Cassie realizes that Eliza is her long-lost daughter. The newly reunited family travels to France and then decides to move to Liberia, the African nation created for former American slaves. George Shelby returns to the Kentucky farm, where after his father's death, he sets all the slaves free in honor of Tom's memory. He urges them to think on Tom's sacrifice every time they look at his cabin and to lead a pious Christian life just as Tom did. So, the book definitely deals with the issue of slavery, and it definitely shows that slavery is evil. There are some critiques about this book in that it just doesn't show the reality of how harsh slave life really was, that it makes it sound like a lot of slave owners were really like, gee whiz, shucks, guys, yeah, I own you, but we can be buddies. And there are some valid criticisms there. But on the most part, it helped start the Civil War, right? So it's a book to pay attention to. All right. So some of the themes, definitely slavery is evil. Okay, Beecher Stowe makes that clear. Slavery is evil, and you see that. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act made it illegal for anyone to help a runaway slave. So this novel attacked the law and the institution it protected. It ceaselessly advocated the immediate emancipation of the slaves and freedom for all people. Each of her scenes, Stowe's scenes that she wrote, helped the plot and the characters, but also served, without exception, to persuade the readers that slavery is evil, that slavery was unchristian, that slavery was intolerable in modern civil society. For most of the novel, Stowe explores the question of slavery in a fairly mild setting, as I was saying. in which slaves and masters have seemingly positive relationships. At the Shelby's house, and again at St. Clair's, the slaves have kindly masters who do not abuse or mistreat them. Stowe does not offer these settings in order to show slavery's evil as conditional. She seeks to expose the vices of slavery, even in its best case scenario. So that's interesting, right? What she is doing is showing you, like, yeah, you can be a good white person who's generally a pretty nice person, but you still own people. You're still a slave owner. That's a problem. So it doesn't matter if you have intentions of freeing your people, you never do it. That still makes you bad. And even if you call yourself a Christian, you are still acting unchristianly in your slave ownership. So even these good Christian slave owners, she's still calling them out and saying, you got a problem. All right. A common defense of slavery at the time, okay, was that slaves benefited because most masters acted in their slaves' best interests. Stowe refutes this argument with her biting portrayals, insisting that the slave's best interest can lie only in obtaining freedom. So you don't get to decide what's in somebody else's best interest. All right. Then, of course, we have the Legree plantation, which definitely shows some of the more violent elements of slavery and slave owningness. This harsh and barbaric setting in which slaves suffer beatings, sexual abuse, and murder introduces the power of shock into Stowe's argument. If slavery is wrong in the best of cases, in the worst of cases, it is nightmarish and inhuman. In the book's structural progression toward pleasant and hellish plantations, we can detect Stowe's rhetorical methods. First, she deflates the defense of the pro-slavery reader by showing the evil of the best kind of slavery. She then presents her own case against slavery by showing the shocking wickedness of slavery at its worst. And all of this definitely leads into how slavery and Christianity are incompatible. And of course, Christianity would have been the major religious movement at the time of this book. I mean, pretty much everyone in America at that day and age would have said to some degree or another they are Christian. Okay? But what she's trying to show here is that it doesn't work. You cannot claim the faith of Christ and be an owner of other human beings. It doesn't work. So, as I said, she was writing predominantly for a religious Protestant audience. Stowe takes great pains to illustrate the fact that the system of slavery and the moral code of Christianity oppose each other. No Christian, she insists, should be able to tolerate slavery. Throughout the novel, the more religious a character, the more he or she objects to slavery. Ava, the most morally perfect white character in the novel, fails to understand why anyone would see a difference between whites and blacks. In contrast, the morally revolting, non-religious Legree practices slavery almost as a policy of deliberate blasphemy and evil. Christianity in Stowe's novel rests on a principle of universal love. If all people were to put this into practice, Stowe insists it would be impossible for one segment of humanity to oppress and enslave another. Thus, not only are Christianity and slavery incompatible, but Christianity can actually be used to fight slavery. The slave hunter, Tom Loker, learns this lesson after his life is spared by the slaves he tried to capture. After being healed by the generous-hearted and deeply religious Quakers, he becomes a changed man. Moreover, Uncle Tom ultimately triumphs over slavery and his adherence to Christ's commands to love thine enemy. He refuses to compromise his Christian faith in the face of the many trials he undergoes at Legree's plantation. When he is beaten to death by Legree and his men, he dies forgiving them. In this way, Tom becomes a Christian martyr, a model for the behavior of both whites and blacks. This story of his life both exposes the evil of slavery, its incompatibility with Christian virtue, and points the way to its transformation through Christian love. And then, of course, we end with the moral power of women, which one of the interesting things here is that this book was written by a woman and is still read today, all these hundreds of years later. So something to be aware of. Although Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin before the widespread growth of the women's rights movement of the late 1800s, the reader can nevertheless regard the book as a specimen of early feminism. The text portrays women as morally conscientious, committed, and courageous, indeed, often as more morally conscientious, committed, and courageous than the men. Stowe implies a parallel between the oppression of blacks and the oppression of women. Yet, she expresses hope for the oppressed in her presentation of women as effectively influencing their husbands. Moreover, she shows how this show of strength by one oppressed group can help alleviate the oppression of the other. White women can use their influence to convince their husbands, the people with voting rights at that time, of the evil of slavery. Throughout the novel, the reader sees many examples of idealized womanhood, of perfect mothers and wives who attempt to find salvation for their morally inferior husbands or sons. The text also portrays black women in a very positive light. Black women generally prove strong, brave, and capable, as seen especially in the character of Eliza. In the cases where women do not act morally, such as Prune and her drunkenness or Casey with her infanticide, the women's sins are presented as illustrating slavery's evil influence, rather than the women's own immorality. Not all women appear as bolsters to the book's moral code. Marie acts petty and mean, and Ophelia begins the novel with many prejudices. Nonetheless, the book seems to argue the existence of a natural female sense of good and evil, pointing to an inherent moral wisdom in the gender as a whole, and encouraging the use of this wisdom as a force for social change. So, there it is. Essentially, we have a book of slaves, Uncle Tom being first and foremost, and how the white people interact with the black slaves, the search for freedom, and of course, just still, one of the things that makes Uncle Tom so interesting is his desire to just do good and be a Christian example to his white masters as well as to his black slave compatriots. So, so here's where we move into where our modern take gets a little bit dicey on this, and that Uncle Tom has become an insult. So these are some headlines from some newspapers. Uncle Tom today, an insult for African Americans who give up or hide their ethnic outlook, traits, and practices in order to be accepted into the mainstream. Dear white people, stop using the term Uncle Tom. You don't get to decide who's a race traitor. Race traitor? Uncle Tom trended on Twitter once the RNC, Republican National Convention, RNC, started showcasing black people to prove President Trump isn't racist. Basically meaning that when black people appeared to be pro-Trump, people started calling those black people an Uncle Tom. Basically saying, you are a black slave under the power of the white master. In this case, it would be Donald Trump and whichever black person spoke on Trump's behalf. Let's see here. The bestseller was meant to rally the moral sentiments of whites against the horrors of slavery, and it succeeded. But the character of Uncle Tom has become synonymous with servility, meaning servitude or serving someone else, and self-hatred, suggesting in this case that black people hate their blackness and really want to just serve the white man. And so when we call a person an Uncle Tom, we're suggesting you just want to be white. It's kind of the insult there. All right, Larry Elder. So here's this Elder, Uncle Tom, blacklisted by Hollywood. Larry Elder is a very famous columnist and writer. I think he's got a radio show, and he's got a movie that came out that I'll show about here in just a minute. But a couple more here. Does Kanye West deserve to be called an Uncle Tom? Because Kanye West was pro-Trump? Snoop Dogg calls Kanye West Uncle Tom amid the 13th Amendment and SNL scandals. And then down here we have, you can feel free to call me Uncle Tom. It does not affect me. You know why? Because I actually read the book. Uncle Tom was the hero. That's what Candace Owens said, and she is a black woman responding to accusations of Uncle Tom. So here's where I land on this. It is vile, it is racist, it is wrong. It's that simple. To call a black person an Uncle Tom in our modern context is to suggest that they are incapable of making up their own, usually political mind. Okay? That it's suggesting that we haven't gotten beyond the kind of slavery racism that some black people are still in service to the white man. And that breaks my heart that that's the conversations that we're having. Um, there's plenty of examples of this out there, and I think it's wrong. I would suggest, do it. Miss Owens says, read the book, make up for your own mind. If you see it as an insult, okay, that is definitely your prerogative. I hope you will see Uncle Tom as the hero, and that his love is something we should all aspire to, and that we should all be disgusted with that kind of racist slavery mindset. And that's disgusting and it's vile. So that's kind of where I land on all that. I think it's a good, important book. I'm going to leave with just this. I'm not going to show it. You can look it up on your own. But Larry Elder did make a movie, Uncle Tom. It came out last year, so it's still pretty important. This is just the trailer. You can find it on YouTube and watch it on your own if you would like. But essentially, it's talking about the idea of modern-day black people making up their own political mind. Can a modern-day black person vote for a white man such as Donald Trump? Which I think is funny because the alternative in the last election was another white man named Joe Biden. I mean, so it kind of put black people into a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where, like, whatever. That's neither here nor there. All right, point is this. Uncle Tom, and Uncle Tom's Cabin. I hope you will read it someday in your life. I think it's important, even today, to have that conversation of slavery, that mindset of the vileness of racism and that kind of evil. Also, this is another book written by a woman, so just, if you are looking for something like that, it's also important for your American history and to understand that kind of cultural background. So I would recommend you read it. Another book that's kind of similar, that's much more modern, and I'm going to blank on the name. Let's see if I can see it over there on the bookshelf. What is it? I've read it. I totally enjoyed it. Dang it. What's it called? I know it's over there somewhere. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up, put it in the notes. I feel so silly. Not Beloved. Well, Beloved might be one of them, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. Anyway, all right. That's all for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for paying attention. Talk to you later.